Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
National interest this week, as you might have expected, is talking about the India-China situation. As we know, the withdrawals or de-escalation in the Pangong area, Kailash ranges, Pangong area, both banks, north and south, has taken place in double quick time. In fact, there was an impression it might take a week longer, but both sides have come back from these positions with alacrity that was not expected. So this is good news. What this does is it gives us a pause to think whether we are now at a stage where we can foresee a larger de-escalation, not just on the line of actual control, but de-escalation, disengagement, and also a restoration of status quo ante, not just territorially, but also strategically between India and China, two big nuclear neighbors, two largest countries in the world with nuclear weapons and large military forces. Now, how close we came to this war? We know now that Lieutenant General Y.K. Joshi, who knows something about fighting wars, because he commanded one of the most decorated battalions in Kargil, J&K Rifles. So he said that we came very close to a real war, or at least a real firefight. And that happened, say, on the nights of 29th and 30th August. That's when tempers were running high. Both sides were smarting from the clash that caused fatal casualties on both sides in Galwan just a few weeks earlier. And now what India had done was they had climbed the dominating positions on the south bank of Pangong Tso, also along the Rizangla, Rechinla area and across the Kailash range, that is west of that area. So these positions put India in a dominating position. Now these are not territories which are in Chinese control, but these are territories which India had not manned because it's too hazardous and too challenging to man these places. But military presence in these places is a threat to the Chinese nerve centers on their side. So they had no choice but to also match up this build-up. Also, the Chinese don't like to be surprised tactically. If anything, until this happened, Chinese had tactical advantage because they had come in and taken territory that they claim on the north bank of Pangong Tso. Similarly, they had come into some area in Gogra, or some area is disputed in Gogra and elsewhere too. So they knew that they had the cards to negotiate with, but this climb on 29th and 30th of August restored that balance. In fact, this is the more reported, the more familiar move. The other move that wasn't reported for a long time and even now has been reported in sketchier detail is the move Indian Army made north of the Fingers region, which means if these are the Fingers region and this is the beach along the lake where the Chinese soldiers are, Indian Army, almost like in mountaineering missions, climbed higher up the ridges of the same fingers so they could then dominate or look down on the Chinese soldiers on the ground. Now, on the ground, lower altitude is more comfortable. But as you know, in mountain warfare, in all warfare, but especially mountain warfare, what is lower may be more comfortable, but it is not more strategic and it is not safer, it is not advantageous. So these things gave India a bargaining chip that the Chinese did not want, and that's when you find that the Chinese came and challenged Indian units who were at these places, hoping that they will go away. And that's when we saw that picture of Chinese with their crude medieval weapons, including what's called as guandaos, which is like machetes tied at the end of poles. They use this in their martial arts kind of theater. They came armed with that, and you saw that picture of them standing eyeball to eyeball with Indian soldiers. That was at a feature called Mukhpari on the along the south bank of Pangong, Pangong Lake. So then once they found that India were not willing to get back, that India had come to stay, India had a purpose, and India also began to then build some infrastructure, lay water pipes, water lines to supply their troops. Also, they found that Indian troops were as well clothed, armed, and India's heavy equipment was that is tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery. They were as well maintained as theirs. Then they got the sense that this standoff was there for a long time. Then it became like a war of attrition. Now, war of attrition, not like trench warfare where people are firing at each other. In fact, if the odd soldier from the Chinese side straight to the Indian side, he was promptly returned baizat वापस to the Chinese side. But it was a battle of attrition, war of attrition with the elements, with altitude that gives you very little oxygen to breathe. Very dry conditions. So and it's a strange place. It's a dry it's a frozen desert. So when the sun comes out, you also get very high ultraviolet radiation. It's also very dry in terms of humidity. Also, to keep these troops supplied, for them to live there, it is very tough in that place. So the idea then was to see whose troops are able to last out the winter. The fact is that both countries' armies, credit where it's due, both countries' armies showed the willingness and determination to stay on there. But we are more concerned about what our side did, the Indian side. So once the Chinese knew that that Indians had come and they had come here to stay, that they had taken some advantageous positions also, and if India stayed on those positions, it's not as if India was about to climb down those heights and go deeper into Aksai Chin and cut off China's highway. Those things are battle games, war games, not that. But the fact is, as long as India was at these heights, China had to have a matching build-up. And that's how you saw these pictures. In fact, you can see one of those on the screen now on, say, Rechinla. Now, if you see Rechinla, it's just a couple of 100 meters wide. It's a very narrow pass. And see how close the two sides have parked tanks to each other. That is not the distance at which tanks fight. Tanks fight now at large distances. This is even in the days when horse cavalry used to fight. They would not be standing this close to each other before actual fighting began, and now this is armored cavalry. This is a different kind of cavalry. So this was almost like these tanks were standing. Now it sounds ridiculous in a head-butting situation, or as if you were only causing a traffic jam on your side just in case the other side decided to come for a drive. So this was a standoff because we were there, they were here. As long as we were there, they were not going to go away. Similarly, as long as they were there up to finger 8 on the banks, on the beaches along the Pangong Lake, we were not going to go away. And similarly, where we had climbed the higher reaches to the north of the lake, along the same ridges or fingers as they are called, we were not going to go away. So both sides decided that a message had been conveyed, and both sides also figured that this battle had evened out. This battle of wits, this battle of elements had evened out, and that's how they engaged more seriously in negotiations, and that's how this disengagement so far has taken place. As we speak, there will be another round of Corps Commanders talks, and I suspect more after that, because there are more areas. There is Demchok, which has less of a problem. There is Depsang, which is the largest problem, and there is Gogra Hot Springs. So these areas are yet to be discussed and yet to be decided. So what happens with all these, we will not take a call on that, because to predict the course of India-China relations now, particularly after what has happened at least twice in the past 9 months, this situation is flatter to deceive, because India and China have looked like they are disengaging, but they haven't. What we have seen so far is the most substantive. So let's keep our fingers crossed and see what happens, because to predict any course of action now will be as hazardous as guessing who's going to win the West Bengal elections next April or May. So as we just described to you, 3 things had become clear by then. Number one, that India was not about to go away. India will not be intimidated now. Chinese knew that. Number two, that neither side wanted this to spill into a war. And both sides were concerned that if troops, if heavy equipment are in such close proximity, something like a Galwan can again happen at any time. And if it happens now, then it will not be without bullets, because at least on 4 occasions, when the Chinese came to challenge Indian troops at these new heights that they had occupied, there were shots exchanged between both sides. Fortunately, maybe mostly in the air or maybe mostly here and there to convey a message, not to hurt anybody. So there were four sessions of firing, exchange of fire between both sides, and hundreds of rounds of fire were exchanged. So both sides knew the hazards in continuing on. And the third point that became very clear now was that in the battle of attrition, both sides had the staying power. So when this kind of stalemate had been reached and both sides had lasted out the winter, they decided the time had now come to find a way back home. For both India and China, this is a particularly difficult genie to put back in the bottle. Also because both have to deal with public opinion at home. India, we know, we watch our commando comic channels, we watch our Twitter, there are claims, counterclaims, exaggerated claims. People believe that in a war, only people from one side die. People believe wars happen as they happen in Sunny Deol movies. But war is a very nasty business. Similarly, on the Chinese side, we might think the Chinese side is very controlled, there is no media, but there is something. So if you see these tweets, for example, by Anand Krishnan, who is a wonderful China expert and one of the senior editors at The Hindu, he speaks the language, he spent several years working in China as a correspondent. He shows you that on the Chinese equivalent of Twitter, that is Weibo, also there is a lot of anger and resentment and fury at these casualties in Galwan, because the Indian side has relied on the TASS, the Russian agency's claim of 45 dead, and the Chinese side, because they got hassled by that, they have now released data saying that they lost 4 people, including the colonel commanding their battalion. So this is a rare thing for the Chinese to admit casualties, but they did it because these claims came up from Indian side. So they had to do this to assuage public opinion at their end, and now they are facing this anger. So both sides now have the compulsion of, when they settle, of going home in such a way that they can claim victory of some sort. So that is what makes the larger reconciliation here more challenging than we might have imagined. Now, this is all still a discussion on the tactical plane. Look at the strategic picture or the geostrategic picture. Even if we can't answer these questions, the big picture is always geostrategic. Now, one big challenge there is we know so little about China. We still don't know for sure why did the Chinese come knocking at our doors so rudely, which they did. Now, Chinese won't tell you. Chinese never tell you. So, Chinese let you guess. So, we guess. We also go by what evidence is available. Now, 3 sets of speculation have been made, coupled by me also. One, that it is after India made Article 370 non-operational in Kashmir and declared Ladakh a union territory, and then the Home Minister in his Parliament speech very emphatically said that we will get Aksai Chin back. So the Chinese thought that they had to deliver a message. So I had written this in National Interest quite some time back, just when this tension began, that we should have known then that come this summer and the Chinese will come in to remind us that it was not so easy to snatch Aksai Chin. That could be one reason. The second reason could be to dissuade India from getting too close to the Americans, because the Chinese have a new Cold War developing. They don't particularly want India to be an ally of America in that new Cold War if they can help it. And third, that was to take away India's attention from its naval power. Now, what do we base all this evidence on? The first one is guesswork, Article 370 and Ladakh, because they came into Ladakh. If they just wanted to convey the larger strategic message, they could have come come towards Arunachal or Sikkim also again, as they did in Doklam. But they came in Ladakh, so that is one evidence that probably this was linked to that Article 370 move. Second, the idea that they are looking at repositioning India strategically from Indian Ocean region back to the north and the west, back to worrying about its land borders. That evidence comes from this new paper, the strategy paper of PLA, a 2013 strategy paper which has just become part of international strategic discussions because the US Air Force Academy has published its full English translation. If you look at the sections it has on India, it divides India's evolution of India's strategic policy in 4 stages. I talked about this in detail on Cut the Clutter, and I will share that link with this description of this national interest, so you can see it there. So I will not go into the detail, but the Chinese believed that after India saw its economy boom after 1991 reform, India began to think that, look, we now have the leeway or the elbow room, first of all, to strengthen our military sufficiently that China and Pakistan cease to be the threat of a full-fledged war on our land borders. If at all there be a skirmish or something, we can handle it. And once that threat of a full-fledged war is out, then India can start, we Indians can start looking southwards at the Indian Ocean, first at the northern part of Indian Oceans, then deeper, then reaching out to South China Sea and becoming part of global strategic groupings to counter Chinese influence there. So what better way to bring India down to what the Chinese see as its harsh reality, but to remind them that the two-front threat still exists. So by coming at Ladakh, by making a shift, so many forces, at least 2 divisions which were earlier oriented towards Pakistan have now been oriented towards China. They have underlined to India the fact that the two-front threat is still a reality. It has not gone away. So the third expectation could be on the Chinese side that this will make India shift its attention away from Indian Ocean region and also shift its resources away from the Navy to land forces. Now, let's check out each one. What has happened, what has not happened. With America, India has only become closer to America. Quad, Biden's arrival, some people might have thought Biden will not be so enthusiastic about the Quad because Trump started it, but he, if anything, has shown even greater clarity and commitment to it. And India's own strategic hesitations of the past are gone. India is not going to heave a sigh of relief now because the Chinese are off my throats. Let me pull back from Quad. That is not about to happen. If you want evidence, see the readouts of the meeting of the 4 foreign ministers, that is US, India, Australia, Japan, which happened this Thursday. And each readout would tell you what they are talking about. The concern on their minds is China, and that is shared. So that is not about to change. So China is not winning in those areas. What we don't know is, and we'll still take about a year and a half to figure it out, if this actually does force India to shift resources away from the Navy to the land forces, which means shift its strategic attention away from Indian Ocean region to its own land borders, because the Chinese would like India to continue believing that it is a power which has to first mostly watch its own land borders instead of looking far away across the oceans. Which brings us to the conclusion of this argument. In conclusion, we look at the strategic picture from India's point of view. If you look at it from India's point of view, you would say that since 1962, India has had a two-front situation, and that is not going away anywhere. Also, no country can handle a two-front war. I know that our soldiers, our leadership of our military, whenever they are asked, serving leadership says we can handle a two-front war. But serving leadership has to say it. They have no choice, but they know, they are smart people. They know that the prospect of a two-front war is a nightmare. Winning a two-front war for any country in the world is a fantasy. It's not going to happen. So the big challenge for Indian strategic planners, for Indian political leadership has always been to avoid a two-front war. Now, in the past, it has been done in different ways. 1971, Mrs. Gandhi signed up a treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation, which included defense with the Soviet Union, and that saved India from a two-front war situation. Although it was a very short war of just 13 days, we don't know how well it would have endured if the war had gone on longer. This was 50 years later now. It is a very different India. This India has much greater power, much greater stakes in the world. So that solution is not available. So India has to now decide, does India want to live with a two-front situation forever or do something about it? Because that is the reminder that the Chinese have served on us. Now, you can double your defense budget. You can become a national security state like Pakistan. I hope we don't. I hope we remain India as we have been. But even if you do all that, even if you make all those terrible sacrifices away from your development, your quality of life, your people, etc., still you cannot be militarily strong enough to think of fighting a two-front war and winning. So this is a triangle that India is caught in. India is triangulated between China and Pakistan. China, Pakistan, India like this. It is for India to break out of this triangulation. It is in India's interest. How does India do that? All of Indian governments so far, pre-Modi, have tried to do it by reaching out to Pakistan, hoping to make peace there. Why? Because any side in any negotiation would think that I'd rather make peace or a deal with the party stronger than me, because I am stronger and that party which is weaker will have a greater vested interest in peace. That hasn't worked yet with Pakistan. We have come close several times, but we know the dynamic in Pakistan and we'll talk about it at some other point of time. That has not worked out. Since Narendra Modi came, he's changed the equation. And that equation remains like this. He's changed it. The Pakistanis haven't helped at all. But we have a situation today when there is no movement in our relationship with Pakistan. The other problem that's now arisen for India is that this is the most political government in India's history. What do we mean by most political? In Hindi, there is a saying, ask a starving man what is 2 plus 2. भूखे को बोलो दो जमा दो, 2 plus 2, वो बोलता है 2 रोटियां. Ask a starving man what is 2 plus 2, he will say 4 rotis. Similarly, if you ask this BJP what is 2 plus 2, they will say 4 votes. This BJP is such an election winning machine that it weighs every bit of policy in terms of its electoral implications. If that is the case, then it's almost like it needs permanent hostility with Pakistan, because Pakistan and the pan-Islamic terrorism are the warp and the weft of the fabric in which you gift wrap Hindu-Muslim polarization in the country. So that becomes a compulsion, and that puts a limitation on the Modi government when it comes to its strategic options. So it has to now make its choices. Either it has to now accept that it has to make some compromises in terms of its electoral interest and the larger national strategic interest. Or, who knows, they may decide that, okay, we'll not make peace with Pakistan, we'll have a settlement with China instead. If so, that will be the more audacious thing to do. That will also be the more difficult thing to do, because we know in that equation who is the stronger party.